Okay, welcome everyone to this session, which will start very soon. So we're just really waiting for everyone to arrive and get set up. So it'll be really nice for you to say hello in the chat box and let us know where you're joining from. So I'm just keeping an eye here on the number of participants, and the numbers are going up quite quickly. We already have nearly 300 participants. So we're expecting over 600. And you'll see on the panel in front of you, there are quite a lot of people willing to give you expert advice on planning for remote teaching in September. I suppose this is a nice opportunity for me to also thank the IUA, the Irish University Association, for hosting this webinar. And we can never forget our paymasters, the Higher Education Authority, for sponsoring the project. I think it's a really good example of a collaborative project across all of the institutions. So thank you very much to the HEA. So we're now up to almost 400. Well, not quite, but we're getting there. Participants, and as I said, we're expecting 600. So I'll just give it a few more minutes and then we can start the webinar. And I don't know where you're from, but the weather in Dublin is beautiful. It's warm. So I hope that's what our experience will be at the end of this webinar. Good, warm feeling. And I can see from the participants registering, we have people from all over the country, from Cork to Donegal and Galway to Dublin. So we have a very wide spread of participation. So it's 12:33. So I would like to get started. Said good afternoon. And you're really very welcome to this session, and I hope it'll be enjoyable and you'll learn something from it, because I certainly will. So my name is Patricia Callaghan, and I'm the Academic Secretary at Trinity College Dublin, but I'm also chair of the steering committee for the IUA project, Enhancing Digital Teaching and Learning. So I have the privilege of chairing today's webinar on the topic, Planning for Effective Remote Teaching in the Next Academic Year. There's been a huge interest in this webinar with more than 600 registrations. And I think that demonstrates the impact that COVID-19 has had already on teaching, learning and assessment in higher education, and the need for support in preparing for a very different teaching environment in September. In March this year, the Irish universities closed their campuses and all teaching and assessment moved online. This was an emergency response to the COVID-19 pandemic, so we had no time to plan. But now, as we prepare for the next academic year, we don't have a lot of time, but we have to turn our attention to providing a teaching and learning environment that best supports student experience in the context of this ongoing social distancing and public health restrictions, but also importantly in the context of the different levels of digital competencies amongst students and staff, the technology infrastructure that's available, the educational software that's available, and the internet connectivity across the institutions, and importantly across the remote working environments of staff and students. So we're joined by a number of panelists, and you can see on the screen we also have people from the project, from the different institutions who are here to answer questions. And we're launching the Enhancing Digital Teaching and Learning project approach to planning for effective remote teaching. And Dr. Sharon Flynn, her team, members, that is Morag Monroe from Maynooth University, and David Maloney, and you can just have a little wave there, from the University of Limerick, and other members of the project team. So they're from all the universities, the 7 universities of the IUA. And they will answer questions either through your little chat box there at the bottom. And if we don't answer questions today, we will answer them after this webinar. Kevin McStravock, who is the Vice President for the Academic Affairs at the USI, will also give us insight into the student experience of remote learning over the past 3 months. And our guest speaker, Professor Martin Weller, he's a Professor of Education Technology at the Open University. So he joins us to give us some insight into successful online and distance education. But before we start, there's a few notices. The webinar is being recorded and we'll make it available after today. If you have a question for the panel, please enter it using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. It may be answered by panel members there, or we will put it to panelists during the question and answer sessions at the end of the 3 presentations. If we don't get to your question, the team will follow up with responses to all registered participants by email after today's webinar. So please use the chat facility for general comments. Conscious of the time, we have until 1:30. We may go over a little, but I'm sure you will want to get away and have some lunch. So now I will hand over to Dr. Sharon Flynn and her team to launch the Enhancing Digital Teaching and Learning approach. Sharon is a project manager for enhancing digital capacity in teaching and learning in the Irish universities. And before joining the IUA, she was the Assistant Director at the Centre of Excellence in Learning and Teaching at NUI Galway, where she focused on academic staff development and led a team of learning technologists. And joining Sharon are team members Morag Monroe from Maynooth University and David Maloney from the University of Limerick. So over to you, Sharon.
Thanks very much, Trish. I'll just share my presentation here. Just as we're getting started, I might ask people, if you are tweeting about today's event, could you please use the #IUADigEd hashtag, which is the hashtag that we've been using as part of the project for the last year or so. What you see on the screen just now is a word cloud, which represents your answers to the question that we asked you on registration. What is your greatest challenge in preparing for the new academic year? And you'll see that there is quite a bit of consistency across the 500 or 600 people who signed up to today's webinar. I'm not promising that we're going to answer all your questions today or respond to all of your concerns today, but what I am hoping is that we'll touch on some of these and we'll maybe offer you a way forward. So thank you, Trish, very much for the introduction today. I want to just tell you a little bit about the Enhancing Digital Teaching and Learning project, a bit of background to it. It's a 3-year project funded under the HEA Innovation and Transformation Scheme, which involves all of the 7 universities of the IUA. So I'm based in the IUA, but I've got project team members who are embedded within each university, and that's the sea of faces that you saw when you first joined the webinar. So I've got a very distributed team, and we also have a student associate intern who helps to bring the student voice to the project. So I'd like to welcome Vish, who's been with us for a number of months now, but will be finishing up at the end of July, and we are going to miss him. The project started in 2019 with the aims of, these are the following aims. So to enhance the digital skills of our university graduates, to enhance the digital learning experience of our students, and this was to be achieved through professional development of all those who teach or support learning. So fair enough. 1 year into the project though, everything changed. So as we know, since March, the middle of March, suddenly everybody was teaching online. And some people actually accused me of planting the virus in order to actually attain the goals of the project. That's not true, by the way, because while the goals remain the same, particularly the one around enhancing this student learning experience, the context has changed completely. Because since March, the middle of March, everybody's been teaching online. The response to the pivot and the response to coronavirus at the time was very much an emergency response. Nobody had any time to plan. The aim over that time was really around continuity of teaching, and most people were trying just to bring their face-to-face practices into the online environment. And for the most part, everybody did extremely well, given the circumstances. But I think that we have to remember that students were very forgiving of the experience. They understood that this was something very, very special happening. And the whole pivot did expose a lot of inequalities. So we know that there were staff and students who were severely disadvantaged because they didn't have the right access to technology, or they didn't have the right environment in order to teach and learn. We also found, and this was the experience of the team at the time, that there was very much a focus on the tools and the technology, and maybe less of a focus on pedagogy and good teaching. So now here we are in a transition period, and this was what the team had to think about over the last little while. We know that things are going to be very different in September to what we would consider maybe normal. We know that there's going to be social distancing still in place, and for health and safety, we're not going to have the same campus experience that maybe we're used to. But the difference is that we have a chance now to learn from the emergency pivot, and we have a very small window to plan and prepare, and maybe to refocus away from the tools and the technologies and back onto pedagogy. What we're aiming for in September is not online teaching. It's not good online teaching, perfect online teaching. What we're looking at is remote learning and trying to find a balance between what we know and maybe something that we're a little bit uncomfortable with. We also know that our students are not online students. They are campus-based students who have not signed up for an online experience. So what the project decided to do a couple of months back was to look at how we can support staff in this transition to a new normal in September. So what we have developed over the last couple of weeks really is being termed the EDTL approach, and some of you may have seen this infographic. What we were aiming for was a pedagogy first approach to getting everybody teaching remotely in September. It's not technology driven. Across the 7 universities of the project, we've got 5 different flavors of VLE. So we're not focusing on any particular technologies, but rather looking at how we can aim for a simple framework that will highlight for staff things to consider for the next academic year. So this is our EDTL approach for planning for effective remote teaching during COVID-19. What we wanted was everything on a single page, something simple with a roadmap for people to follow. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hand it over to Morag, who's going to begin taking you through some of this EDTL approach.
Thank you, Sharon. The EDTL approach infographic that Sharon showed on the last slide intentionally places the student at the centre, and this was a deliberate decision emerging from our collaborative development of the EDTL approach. We feel that a student-centred approach that considers our students' needs, perspectives and experiences is fundamental to effective remote teaching. So, in considering your students, we suggest that it would be useful for you to reflect on the following questions and to consider their implications for your own contexts. So first of all, do bear in mind that learning almost completely online is not necessarily what your students signed up for. While some of them may have had some experience of online learning as part of the pivot, for others, learning online will be an entirely new experience. For example, incoming first years or returners to higher education may have never used a virtual learning environment. They may have never participated in an online classroom, and they may have limited experience of online assessment. Even those who experience the pivot to online learning will need to adjust to an entire semester where much of their learning takes place online. And so all of this will have implications for the extent to which you need to support and scaffold students in their transition to learning online. It's also important to reflect on who your students are. There will of course be diversity in their backgrounds, in their living circumstances, in their work and caring commitments, and in their learning goals. There may also be some specific considerations that are particular to students in your own context. We also suggest that you consider their access to devices suitable for learning on. their access to the internet, and their digital skills levels. Given this diversity, we suggest that you can't assume that all student circumstances are as suitable for learning or as reliable as you might ideally like. We're of course aware that your own teaching context will determine the extent to which you can answer these questions. So Kevin's presentation today will be a great starting point for beginning to understand the needs and concerns of your students. Another great source of insights into the student experience is our EDTL Higher Education in Isolation video vlog series. Finally, when considering your students, a key consideration will be the size of the student groups that you teach. This will have implications for the learning and teaching strategies that you use, as well as the technologies that will be most appropriate. So our next suggestion in respect of planning for remote teaching is to take some time to reflect on the emergency pivot. So first of all, think about what worked well. You might consider, again, not only your own perspective, but also that of your students. So, for example, you have probably very rapidly gained new skills, knowledge, and insights about online teaching that you can build on in preparing for the new academic year. For your students, perhaps the pivot created new opportunities for them to engage with you or with each other online. Also consider what did not work well. There may be things that you can't change, but there may be things that you might do differently in the future based on what you've learned. A final suggestion in the context of reflecting on the pivot is to consider any student feedback that you have already gathered or that you can gather. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague David Maloney, and he's going to talk about the next two themes in the EDTL approach: content and activities, and communication and engagement.
Thanks, Morag. I'm briefly going to take a look at the next two boxes that appear on the module level infographic, and I'll speak to the points on the left of the slide first, then on the right. So beneath this consider content and activities section, the first thing we're asked is to review learning outcomes. And at this time, it's important to consider them and to ask yourself if your existing ones can be attained by students in what will be an adapted version of your module. If they can be attained, consider the ways in which students can provide evidence of this attainment, potentially in a new way. If you're unsure or don't feel that they can be currently attained, perhaps reach out to an educational developer, learning technologist, or someone who can support you at your institution to discuss this. There may be a window of time at your institution to make small changes to them if needed. Secondly, at the EDTL project, we're conscious that most people will want to adapt parts of their module rather than redesign their module from scratch. So think about the existing content that you already have to hand that could be reused and readily adapted to your remote teaching context. Thirdly, balancing what the students will experience synchronously or live in real time with what they experience asynchronously, not live in real time, is an important decision. Small and often unconscious choices about the tools and technologies we use can have a big impact on how inclusive and effective our teaching is. In the current context, consider that students mightn't always be able to attend to module work immediately or even at designated times. So as a result, asynchronous activities might be more reasonable than synchronous ones, and flexibility with regard to access and deadlines may be the order of the day. Fourthly, content and activities should obviously align with course learning outcomes. One good way to understand how students will engage with content and activities is to yourself have an experience of online learning, or to speak with colleagues, family, and friends who have had these experiences. Putting yourself in the shoes of your students is a great way to understand how engagement with content and activities can happen. Fifthly, accessibility is about providing accessible options to an increasingly diverse student population, including students who use assistive technologies like screen readers, text-to-speech, and other accessibility features. Furthermore, policy and legislation at national and EU level promotes a more inclusive and accessible practice in supporting students with disabilities in higher education. And lastly, many higher education institutions are in the process of making virtual learning environment templates to help faculty to structure and organize their programs and modules in a consistent and coherent manner. The EDTL project encourages the use of these templates. So moving on to the next slide and the next box on the infographic now, consider communication and engagement. So intentional planning for effective remote teaching and learning includes not just identifying the content to cover, but also carefully considering how you're going to support the different types of interactions that are important in the learning process. Our EDTL approach recognizes learning not solely as information transfer or transmission, but as both a social and a cognitive process where students are active participants in their learning. One very important aspect of adapting a module for effective remote teaching is to ensure that clear, realistic, unambiguous and explicit expectations are set and established at the very outset. This could happen in a visible place near the top of your module page, perhaps on the VLE. Setting these expectations not only serves to allow you put forward how you're going to engage with your students, but also provides them with the opportunity to provides you with the opportunity to let your students know how you prefer them to engage with you also. Secondly, in order to make module information clear and easy to find, consider perhaps having a dedicated module information section that includes signposting information for your students immediately visible on arriving at your module page. Thirdly, select appropriate tools for class communications. Reach out to those in your institution who provide and support the institutionally supported digital tools. To make this a considered and coordinated experience for students, it's advisable that discussion about digital tool selection happens at a programmatic level in an attempt to avoid overloading students with ad hoc exposure to many different tools across the program. And finally, plan for engagement and community building. To ensure a connected student experience, consider and plan for engagements that incorporate learner interactions, not only with the module content and with you as the teacher, but also between the students themselves to foster a community among peers. In short, research shows that the presence of each of these types of interaction, when meaningfully integrated, helps to increase student opportunities to attain learning outcomes. So I'll now hand you back to my colleague Morag to discuss some considerations for assessment and feedback.
Thanks, David. So yes, the final area that we suggest that you consider as part of the EDTL approach is assessment and feedback. So a key challenge over the last few months has been the need to rapidly reconsider and redesign assessments and exams for remote delivery. In this, the pivot has demonstrated that in many cases, and as David mentioned earlier, there can be more than one way for a student to demonstrate that they've achieved a particular learning outcome. While you had to very quickly redesign assessments and exams in the context of the pivot, you do now have a little bit more time to consider how you might diversify your assessment approaches, how you might incorporate opportunities perhaps for authentic assessment, and also to consider how technology can support the provision of student feedback. If you do plan on introducing a new assessment approach, particularly if that assessment is a high stakes one, then we suggest that you provide opportunities to practice in a low risk context. So for example, if you'll be using an online quiz as a high stakes exam, perhaps provide an opportunity for students to take a practice quiz well in advance of the exam. Finally, we suggest that you might consider using technology to incorporate opportunities for your students to engage in peer assessment and feedback, as well as self-assessment. So that concludes our overview of the EDTL approach for effective remote teaching of modules. I'm now going to hand back to Sharon, who will talk about the EDTL approach for programs.
So thanks, Morag and David. I'm conscious that we're moving along very swiftly. So I just want to mention a couple of things before I finish up, Trish. First of all is that we also have developed an infographic aimed at people who are looking at converting entire programs to the remote environment. So the main focus in this infographic is around consistency across modules and providing consistency for students. Both of these infographics are available as open resources on the EDTL project site, which I'll pop into the chat window in a few minutes, and can be downloaded and repurposed as you like. They have been developed collaboratively, very collaboratively across the 7 universities. The next steps in terms of the team's work, and something that we've already started, is to curate and develop a very small set of resources for each of the themes that David and Morag spoke about. Those resources will be openly available, hopefully within the next 10 days or so. They will be initially available on our project website, but we are speaking to the National Forum about hosting them there. And because they're open, obviously they are available to everybody beyond the 7 universities and internationally. And the third thing that we are going to do then is to host a series of associated webinars, and information about the webinar series and our IUA DigEd community is also available on our project website. So do have a look at that. And as I say, I'll pop the link into the chat window in just a minute. So that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. I will stop sharing there and hand back over to Trish.
Okay, thanks, Sharon. Thank you very much. To Morag also, and to David. So I'm now going to ask Kevin McStravock, who is a graduate of Ulster University, and Kevin is in his 2nd term as the President for Academic Affairs, or the Vice President rather, for Academic Affairs of the Union of Students in Ireland. So you have the floor, Kevin. Are you there, Kevin?
Hi, everybody. Hope you're all well. Yep, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you well.
Perfect. I am just getting my presentation up. There you go. Hopefully you should all be able to see that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch my camera off, because unfortunately I am joining you from County Derry, and what it has in picturesque views, it unfortunately lacks an internet connection, but hopefully you can hear me loud and clear. My name, as Trish said, is Kevin McStravock. I'm the Vice President for Academic Affairs for the Union of Students in Ireland, and I'm also a member of the steering group of the EDTL project. And I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you a bit about some of the lessons learned emerging from the COVID-19 crisis and the rapid switch to remote learning. So I'm referring today to some of the high-level results of the USI COVID-19 survey, which were completed at the beginning of June. So we received just over 1,200 responses. The survey was focused on 3 main areas: teaching, learning and assessment, finance and accommodation, and mental health and well-being. And unsurprisingly today, my focus is going to be on teaching, learning and assessment. So you can see there in this slide a bit about the demographics of students who answered the survey in terms of types of institution they attended, their levels of study and their year groups. So a good sample across the different types of institution and different year groups, mostly undergraduate students, but we did have some representation from postgraduate students too. So I'll get straight into it. In terms of the student experience during the pandemic, some of the key things I alluded to at the start by Sharon, there was definitely a sense that the emergency pivot towards remote teaching and learning wasn't exactly what students had expected when they signed up for their institutions. But there was a general consensus that they were exceptional times, exceptional circumstances, and all students really recognised that staff were thrown in just as much into the deep end as they were. And we're trying their best to, and I've used this term because it came up quite strongly in some of the open text responses, to get to safety, to get the current academic year completed, and allow students to progress on to the next level of study, or those who are due to graduate to be able to successfully graduate. Over half of students stated that they thought that the online learning content was of a good quality, but there were some issues that did arise for both staff and students over the past number of months. And we get a sense of some of those issues through the feedback. So almost 80% of students reported having issues with motivation during their studies. And a large part of that was the fact that they were so rapidly sort of transformed into this remote learning environment. They didn't have the same level of peer interaction that they would have when they were on campus. And for many of them, it took a while to be able to kind of get their bearings and to be able to wrap their head around what was expected of them to be able to complete their assignments. Just under a third had issues with internet connection. And obviously, anyone who has dodgy Wi-Fi will know the anxiety that that in itself causes, particularly if they're trying to engage with any form of online live lectures or classes. And that obviously then has an impact on their learning. And nearly a third of students felt that their colleagues didn't provide them with effective and timely communication. And that was one of the key things that came through, the need to ensure that there is really good communication and really consistent communication across the colleges, and that any of the high level communication coming through from the institution themselves is then consistent with what they're hearing at a local level. So there's a need to ensure that there's that strong and consistent messaging coming throughout the institution. So moving on then to the assessments themselves, we asked them about the alternative arrangements for assessment and what they thought worked well and what they thought could be improved. So you can see there what came through in those answers. There were free text responses, but we've categorized them into the key areas that they identified. So in terms of what worked well, I think the overarching answer to this was the word flexibility. A lot of the key things the students identified were in relation to flexibility. So it was flexibility in the time allowed, where students had the opportunity to request extensions in quite a flexible manner. That was identified. Exam formats, particularly the use of open book assessments and the use of continuous assessments, were identified. And perhaps what might be surprising, given that it also caused a lot of stress for students and staff, the studying from home came up, and it came up in the context of students feeling much more comfortable being able to complete an exam in their own home environment than they would if they were going into an exam hall and sitting down to do a 2 or 3 hour paper. And that came up as something that students felt worked quite well. So it's something to, I suppose, reflect on moving forward. In terms of things that could be improved then, the time and the notice given for assessment came up quite strongly, and was just under half of responses identifying that as a key area for improvement. And again, it probably comes back to what I said at the start about the rapid change and the need to try and complete the academic year. And unfortunately, because of that, and because of the need to try and get as many students as possible through the year, there was a sense that some of them felt slightly caught up in that, and were quite stressed about what was expected of them for the assignments, and how they could move forward and complete the assignments to the best of their ability. Communication came up, and it was communication both in terms of what the assignments were going to look like, and also what would be expected of them. And that consistency of communication came through, and I'll go on to speak about that in the lessons learned piece. And then finally, the method of assessment. And there's always going to be, mixed opinions in terms of what assessment works best, because everybody has different strengths and weaknesses. Some people prefer exams, some people prefer assignments, some people love group work, some people hate group work. But it's that flexibility piece again. It's about trying to ensure that you can build in enough different types of assessment to be able to play to the strengths of different students, and that there's that ongoing support to students who maybe struggle with certain elements of assessment too. And there were some really practical things that came up too there in terms of the format of exam platforms, that students were able to go back on answers they'd completed, and other pieces around the use of word counts for open book assessment. So lots of different and quite valuable feedback on what can be improved going forward. And then moving on to the lessons learned for the terms ahead. So coming in really strongly with over half of responses, students talked about the ability to access online content in a more structured format. They recognised that the fact that things had to be moved online in such a rapid way meant that they couldn't necessarily expect to be accessing it in the same way that they would their on-campus experience. But a large number of students, particularly given the large number of students who talked about issues of motivation, would like some sort of a structure around how they access their online learning, so that they have a timetable, or they have timetabled classes that they attend online, which gives them a bit of a structure and allows them to structure their own day and discipline themselves in terms of their learning. And the need to allow for every student is extremely important, and it's something that's already been identified by the EDTL project team. ensuring that you're able to provide flexible ways of students being able to access online content, to allow for students with Wi-Fi issues, to allow for students with care and responsibilities, to allow for students with accessibility requirements, is really important, so that every student has the opportunity to access learning in whatever format is best for them. The use of blended learning came up really strongly, and students really want that face-to-face interaction. Obviously, that can only be delivered in certain ways this year, and it's subject to public health response and public health advice. But ensuring that there is some form of community created that can be fostered not only on campus, but online too. They identified having had no formal opportunities to engage with other students through their learning during the COVID-19 crisis. Yet when we asked them about the supports they relied on during that period, nearly 80% listed peer support as a main source of support for them. So it's really clear that they really want that opportunity to engage through their learning with the other people in their class and to learn from one another. The digital divide needs to be addressed, and that's both in terms of wide devices, and I know that that's something that institutions have been very strong in responding to, and hopefully will continue to be able to respond to really strongly. But there's a need to also ensure that there's access to other online resources. So ebooks, any essential software packages that they're required to use as part of their learning, and any other learning resources that would be useful for them. And then finally, and again, it aligns very closely with what's already been said by the team, training and support is really important. And students actually identified that it wasn't just training and support they wanted for themselves, but also those opportunities for their staff, because they recognise that staff don't necessarily have an encyclopedic knowledge of all of the digital tools and technologies out there. And they were starting to learn as things were going along in the same way that students were too. But students absolutely want to ensure that there's some level of support available for them, so that they're able to get used to some of the platforms they may be expected to interact with over the next year. In terms of the next steps, and that was a really whistle-stop tour. So as I said at the start, we're still undertaking some analysis of this survey, but we're hoping to have the full survey, which will be all three categories, ready and released by the start of July. There's an upcoming webinar being hosted by the National Student Engagement Programme in mid-July. The date's still to be confirmed, but we're hoping to talk in a little bit more detail about some of the findings, particularly from the student engagement perspective, and what the key lessons are in terms of student engagement in the context of COVID-19 at that webinar. And then finally, we've been working very closely with Quality and Qualifications Ireland, the QA agency for Ireland, as part of the teaching, learning and assessment evaluation that they are leading on behalf of the tertiary education sector's response to COVID-19. And the feedback from the teaching, learning and assessment element of this survey is being fed directly into that project. So again, we're ensuring that that student voice and those student perspectives will be very much at the forefront of the national response to the COVID-19 crisis in terms of teaching, learning and assessment. So thank you very much. I'm going to turn my camera back on for the Q&A session later. I'm very happy to take any questions you may have.
Thanks very much, Kevin, for that. Really interesting findings and very useful, I'd say, for all the universities in our planning for 2020 academic year. So now I'm going to go to Professor Martin Wheeler, who is Professor of Educational Technology at the Open University. He has played an integral part in making the Open University an online distant learning provider and introducing a number of programs that have shaped the university. So we're really very grateful for his presentation today. His availability, you can imagine he's very busy. His research area is in open education and digital scholarship. And he also writes a very well-known blog, edtechie.net. So Professor Wheeler, over to you. Do you have your
Okay, good. I couldn't find it. The little bar disappeared. Can you?
We can hear you now.
Cool.
Good.
And can you see my slides?
We can. Yeah.
Are they in full mode? There we go. Is that in full screen mode? Cool.
Full screen, looks good.
Yeah, cool. Okay, great. Thanks for inviting me to speak today, and impressive turnout in a short time as well. Really well done to the team. And I think there's lots of good advice that the team are giving there. But I think the thing that you'll probably gather from that, and which you probably know already, is that there is no magic button to kind of doing this shift online. You know, it's kind of, it will vary where you are and what your institution's like, or what experience people have there. I think Sharon was sort of saying about how there are kind of different phases of this online pivot, if you like. There was a kind of emergency phase, and we're moving into the kind of the second phase now, which is when there's a bit more time and the students are coming and they'll have certain expectations. But beyond that, I think there's a third or even a fourth phase where we start to think about what are the kind of longer term institutional structures we want to do around this stuff. So my presentation, I'm going to give some sort of thoughts around that sort of second to third stage, I think. I'm particularly thinking about how we can make higher education more of a robust system, if you like. So this is my kind of hypothesis in short, if you like. So the internet is designed to be a robust system, and so in many ways is distance education. And so I think there are some things we can take from that, think about what the pandemic's revealed about frailties in our system. So there are a number of kind of areas of fragility, I think, that have been exposed during the pandemic, which we'll need to think about as we go forward, whether that's because there will be another wave of the pandemic, or there might be other effects, maybe it'll be global warming, but I think we're going to see increasingly impacts upon how we conduct our performance in higher education. So some of the problems that it exposed was traditionally it's kind of based on bringing people to one location, the kind of one physical location, the university campus. There are these real kind of crunch points in it. So exams are kind of a real weak point, if you like, where you have to bring everyone together to the same location at exactly the same time, and that's the main part of the assessment you have. If you don't have that, you can't give them their awards and stuff. So so I think the pandemic really revealed what a kind of crunch point exams are in the system. Another problem is that all aspects of the education are co-located generally. You know, so your library is on campus, your social interaction is on campus, your your lectures are on campus, your small workshops, your laboratories, they're all in the same place. If you shut that down, you don't have access to any of these things. And it's also arguably reliant on other systems which are also fragile, such as entry exams. So my daughter's off to university in September, and so she was in the year where they suddenly cancelled A-levels. And of course, then there's a knock-on effect for the university systems and college systems who are waiting for A-level results to take people in. So there's a kind of weakness throughout the system there. And just to sort of think about how the internet is designed as a kind of metaphor, really. So the internet was designed to be a robust system that would survive attack. So it's open in that you could hook up any device to it as long as it conforms to protocols. It's distributed, so it's all over the place, and there's no one central hub, and it's decentralized, so no central hub has control over it. And that means you can knock a bit out and the rest will still carry on. So I saw this meme on Twitter, and I kind of thought I'd pinch it. So apologies to whoever made it. But in some ways, this is what it's felt like over the past few months. You know, like suddenly people going, "Hey, we can do this online in Zoom. Why don't we Zoom all our lectures?" And I understand that's kind of been an emergency response, but it's kind of been a bit like we've been doing this stuff for quite some time, and there is kind of a lot of expertise here. And I think increasingly people want to kind of pick up on that stuff. So just to kind of pull out those strands I mentioned around kind of the internet design, so how they can help in education. So openness, there are many ways this can help. So you have open resources. So I do a lot of work into open educational resources. These come with an open license. So at the end, I'll put up a link to our open learn site at the university, but others available. There are open textbooks. What that means is you can just take those and reuse them in your course. You have to acknowledge where they've come from. You can remix them to make them more applicable to your course. So you don't need to invent everything. You know, you can have the core of a course, the kind of main content you can get from elsewhere, and perhaps you devise some of the activities that go around it. We are open entry at Open University, so we're not reliant on people to get certain grades to come to us. Open source, as in like lots of software that you can be self-hosted, so you're not reliant on university systems to run these things. And open access publishing, so people can access the material anywhere, anytime, and they're not reliant on other systems that may go down. Distributed, so our model, although at the Open University we do have a central location in Milton Keynes, so we're not quite as distributed as we could have been. But in general, the process is distributed. So we have part-time tutors who we call associate lecturers, who are distributed around the country, and they do the kind of face-to-face or online interaction with the students. Students are distributed everywhere, so they don't need to come to one location. Academics are generally distributed around, and so a lot of the support staff. So that makes it much more robust if you need to close down one physical location, you're not suddenly closing down the whole system, as it were. And decentralized, I've sort of chosen to interpret in terms of time often as well. So we rely a lot on asynchronous activity, and that's really beneficial. That gives lots of advantages to students. I'll come on to a bit later. It does also mean it gives a lot of responsibility to students. So being able to study at your own time around things, particularly when there's a pandemic on, suddenly you're faced with extra childcare responsibilities, whatever. Being asked to turn up for a lecture at a set time, it can be really difficult. If you can study at your own time and work around that, that's kind of very beneficial. And also our module teams are team-based, so they're not reliant on one individual. So if one individual becomes ill or sick, or can't work or has extra caring responsibilities, there's a kind of robustness in the system. And I think one way to think about this is the idea of resilience. So resilience has become one of those terms that's sort of been overused recently. So people talk about kids having grit and resilience, but it actually came from ecology. People used to talk about the resilience of a population to survive changes in the environment. And Walker and al. Said there were kind of 4 aspects of resilience, which were latitude, which is the amount of system can be changed before losing stability. Some systems can change quite a lot, but they can still recover. Resistant, which is how resistant it is to being changed. Precariousness, which is how close it is to collapse. And panicky, which is the influences of forces above and below the population. So in a ecology, that might be climate change, or it might be use of chemicals in the environment or something. And I think you can use these to kind of score your own institution in terms of your COVID-19 response. So like give yourself a score out of 10 for each of these. And I've actually done this not for COVID-19, but for other changes in higher education. And it's quite an interesting process to do, because it really brings up a kind of conversation where someone will say, well, I think we're really robust around that area. And someone will say, no, we're not, we're really weak. So just having those different scores is kind of actually interesting to do as a kind of strategic thing. So you might think, latitude is, can your institution change with how it teaches and still operate? Is the face-to-face model really embedded in what you do? Resistance, is there a history of adapting to change, or will it be difficult with staff or support teams? Precariousness, for instance, of what state our finance is in, and then panicky, which you might think of effects such as research funding, political shifts, reliance on international students, those kind of things. So I think you can think about your own institution for any of these with how it responds to COVID. And so I think just kind of thinking going forward into sort of stages 2 and 3 of the response, I think one thing we'll have to do is think about the critical points in the system, in the higher education system, which are things like exams, big lectures, physical resources, how much people have access to them, laboratories, those kind of things. And we'll need to kind of develop more robust systems, I think, which would have these kind of features. I think so that they would be more online, not necessarily all online, more open in many ways, using much more use of asynchronous, blended approaches, and probably more project-based and continuous assessment-based. So that's my kind of big hypothesis. I thought I'd give just some tips at the end, kind of perhaps with September in mind a bit more, and I think a lot of the team have covered a lot of these already, actually. So I would say, make use of open educational resources. So there's a link to Open Learn, and I'll give these out afterwards. But there's also, in the US, they make heavy use of what they call open textbooks. So you can look at something called OpenStax. There's content there that you can take and adapt and use, and that's fine. So you don't need to produce everything from scratch. Set expectations. I think this is a really important point. So here I'm talking about student expectations. So the link I've given there is a free course we give out, which is like how to be an OU student. So we ask students to study a course on how to be a student before they start with us. And there's also a similar one in Open Learn, which I think is, am I ready to be a distance learner? So you can look for those. So I think helping your students understand the different contexts they're coming into is going to be really important, because the way I like to put it is, when you go to a campus university, the architecture does a lot of the work for you. You go to a lecture at a certain time to learn something. You go to another building, the library, to get your resources. You might go to the cafe for your socialization. You might go to smaller rooms for workshops and discussion, those kind of things. And in all that's kind of set around a timetable and around the buildings. When you go online, or at least blended, a lot of that, the student has to take on a lot of responsibility for organising all those things. So getting them to kind of take responsibility for their own learning, but also to develop some agency around that. They can be quite powerful, like structuring their own learning, and lots of students like that kind of flexibility. They do need to understand that it's a shift from what they might have been expecting or experience. And put learn from others, so the link I've put there is Dave Cormier, who's a Canadian guy who put together this online learning in a hurry, which is what the OLIAH stands for, which are kind of 5 or 10 minute clips of people just talking about aspects of putting your learning online that might be useful. So they're kind of nice little chunks you can go and look at. I put blend according to the best use of the medium. So many of you may be having, some face-to-face and some online. So I think, think about and try to think strategically, what's the best use of face-to-face? Where does that really benefit? And what's the best use of getting people online? I think rethink assessment. Many of you may be caught into certain governance structures where you have to do certain types of assessment, but I think this has really exposed the problem around exams, and we can do a lot of stuff with project-based assessments, and students tend to engage with that, and it's also a good way to kind of keep engagement throughout the course if they feel they're building towards something. Encourage student activity and collaboration, and there's a slightly cheating aspect to this, in that getting students to do stuff and share stuff between each other and engage is actually a really good use of their time, but it also means that's time that you don't have to fill up in a course design, if you like. So if you want students to understand something, you don't need to provide all the resources, but you can ask students to go away and find useful resources and review them and share them with each other. And that's useful for them. That's kind of a good exercise in evaluating resources. It also means that not all of the onus comes on you as an educator to do that. I've mentioned asynchronous activity, and I think the kind of benefits that has for lots of students. But that doesn't mean you can't have some synchronous, but it's much like the kind of blending according to the best use of the medium. When is synchronous really the thing you need to do? This is probably for like stage 3 or something, but shifting to some model based on learning design that's making you think, what is it I want to teach, and what's the best way to teach that, and structuring it around different types of design activity will certainly work. And similarly, working in teams, I think, this will depend on your institution, but I think as we kind of move forward into this becoming part of the long term and part of policy, the institutional structures will need to operate around teams much more, I think. But also, I think it's good to remember that actually, when the dust settles, we might have a much more blended approach at the end of this. That's actually a good thing, I think, for students. We've kind of carried on with the same model of big lectures often and that stuff, and actually a blended approach might get them to have the best use of face-to-face time and the best use of online time, and a bit more flexibility around the structures and stuff. So the thing that comes out the other end might end up being actually beneficial for everyone. And lastly, I'm sure I don't need to say this, but be kind, I think, to students as well. They're going through a lot. I was in a meeting the other day, and someone was saying they were worried that because we had changed the assessment, that more students might get first than normal. I thought, so what? So they've lived through this pandemic as much as us. It's like if they get a first out of the end of this, good on them. So I'll end there, because I think we might want to have some questions as well.
Oh, thank you very much, Martin. That was really, really interesting. So delegates will now see that we have a full panel, and that is members from each of the Irish universities, IUA members. And we've received a lot of questions as part of the registration. And Sharon has collated those and looked at the most common questions. And also I'm just looking at the chat, the questions and answers here. There are a lot of similarities to what we're now going to pose. So I'm going to take some time to ask a few questions, and I will start. And Martin, if you don't mind, I might go to yourself. because what's really clear, and certainly from the survey we have done in TCD and Trinity College Dublin, that this issue of student engagement is hugely important, and many staff are concerned about how can they get student engagement. So maybe you have a few tips that you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of things in there. So first of all, you can get students engaged in distance courses. It's not impossible in online courses, and I think, but retention often is lower with online courses. So I mean, that is kind of something we do find, but that might be a function of the type of students you get, and also we're all going to be facing a unique situation where there was some research done a while ago, which sounds obvious, but students who choose distance education like distance education, and students who choose campus-based education like campus-based education. What we've got now is students who've chosen campus-based education but are getting some form of distance education. So there may be a kind of mismatch around their expectations. So I think you're absolutely right to pick up on engagement, and I think part of that comes down to the design. So you make sure you're having lots of feedback as students go along. Students often, when they're studying more remotely, don't have a feel for how well they're doing, because they're not chatting to other people as much, they can't get a sense. So building lots of opportunities for feedback, even if that's just quizzes or assignments early on that you can give some feedback on. If you are doing face-to-face, you have some blended approach, and make sure those things are really engaging and exciting. You're not just kind of repeating the stuff you've done online. And building, I think, was it David was saying that some students like group work and some students hate group work. Group work's always a bone of contention, but it is some kind of activity, some kind of collaborative activity with students where they get to engage with each other is important. And there's plenty of research that says students who make social connections with other students tend to stay the course much more. So I mentioned kind of the way the architecture does a lot of the work for you. That does mean some of that responsibility to encourage those sort of kind of social connections would fall to you as the educator, rather than just relying on them meeting up in the bar or whatever. So building things like icebreaker activities and regular chats and those kind of things, so just helping students encourage even kind of informal connections and stuff. And I think you can have a range of activities, from kind of really full-on group work where they kind of have to produce a joint project, which is kind of really hard work, to kind of quite light versions of collaborative activities where they're kind of sharing resources and getting a bit of feedback from others, but at least they kind of feel like they're engaging and they're not just sitting there and receiving, and it's time to sit down and watch that 1 hour lecture again, which you can very easily lose motivation in that.
Okay. Does anyone else in the panel like to respond to that? Because I'm just very aware that it's a hugely important concern for the lectures. Kevin.
Thanks. Yeah, I think Martin's covered it off really well. The only thing I would add to that, I suppose, is working collaboratively with the students, ideally through the class representatives, and getting their feedback and their ideas on how you can best foster that sense of community. And I think the informal opportunities to engage, whether it's through an NSL quiz or something quite informal, just so that the students can get to know one another in the class, is really important, particularly I think for new cohorts, first years, who won't have the same opportunities to build that community as the students who have just experienced the online pivot, who already had that face-to-face interaction, obviously limited.
And Kevin, and this is probably a question to Cliona, Callaghan and in UCC, we're looking at, as I said earlier, very different competency levels across our lecturing staff, our teaching staff. So how can you support staff with very low levels of digital competence to actually engage students?
Thank you, Patricia. Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question. And I have 4 pieces of advice, 4 tips. I tried to keep it to 3 because we'll probably only remember 3, but we'll try and go with 4. Firstly, remembering that you are not alone. We're all in this together at the moment, and it is exceptional times, and people have a lot going on outside of their work, let alone within their work. And it's really important that we all just recognize that and support each other. Imposter syndrome. I'm sure a lot of people have heard of this already. And, you know, you may be an expert, but it's impossible to be an expert in everything. And for instance, I have the word digital in my job title, and I am just petrified when it comes to technology still. And I worry all the time that I'm going to do something wrong or present myself in a bad way when it comes to digital education. And so, you know, it is so normal to feel like that. And I think recognizing that it's okay and that it's normal is very important as a first step.
Okay.
The fact that you're willing to learn, the fact that you're here at this webinar says so much, and so bearing that in mind. Number two, then, reaching out. Reaching out is so important. Within your own institutions, there are so many layers of support, and we appreciate that sometimes that can be very overwhelming. So you can look at these and go, where do I even start? Who do I go to first? But, you know, going to anyone, just reaching out to any one of those departments. For example, in UCC, I work in the Centre for Digital Education. So reach out to us, and if we're not the right person in that moment in time, we'll point you in the right direction. But the important thing is that you have reached out and just contact someone. And even just on that point, all of us on this panel are working in different universities, and we are contact people that you can even make contact with if you don't know where to start. And it doesn't even have to be in your specific university. Contact any one of us just to get going, so reach out. Number three, then, have a trusted friend. We talk about a critical friend in academia, and it's the same thing when it comes to teaching and learning. Have someone that you can practice with and press the wrong buttons with and do different practical exercises with in advance of when when you need to do it, and support each other, because that trusted friend, and it might be more than one, will just become absolutely invaluable. And then fourth and finally, just as by way of advice, we mentioned this already about pedagogy first, and we really mean that. In the digital education world, your teaching has to come first. The technology will follow and will work with you. Trust us on that. You see in our infographic that considering your technology is just one theme within 5. And that's very important to remember, that the technology is not leading you, your teaching goes first.
Okay.
We are currently developing a reflection tool as well for staff to build confidence, because we realize over the last few months, staff have developed their skills in so many different ways that they don't even realize and appreciate themselves because of that imposter syndrome, because we have barely any time to recognize it and acknowledge it. And that will be part of our resource pack, which we will release. And just finally to say that we are there to support you, and don't hesitate to contact us. We understand where you're coming from.
Thank you so much for clearing up some really useful tips there. And of course, it'll all be posted out to the delegates. And I'm also conscious there's been quite a lot of discussion around how do we get hand-on practical courses? How do we cope with remote teaching in that environment? And Cesar, I think you might be able to help us with that question. Cesar is from UCD.
Thank you so much. Yeah, my name is Cesar, and I belong to the College of Science in UCD. And yeah, I think courses that have a more hands or practical approach would certainly struggle to cope with remote teaching. Depending on the type of let's say, practical lab or session that you're teaching, you might want to consider different alternatives to deliver your content online. But such alternatives are going to depend on the type of learning outcomes that you're expecting from your students. So for example, if you have someone who's teaching how to perform a technique that students are expected to be able to do, for example, perform CPR, or take blood pressure, or the use of a microscope, then they would probably need a different approach than a lab or a practical, where the main objective is to analyze the data that is collected during the lab session. So for example, if you want to analyze a blood sample image that was taken with a microscope, you want to analyze the effect of tension, force, and different materials. So in those cases, you might want to instead consider giving them raw data that could be in the form of images, some readings that you might take in the lab, some data sets, and then just ask them to perform the analysis at home. You may also want to consider including an explanation video on how the data was collected. having in mind that type of learning outcome that you expect from students is going to guide the selection of the method and digital tools that you want to use. In general, to cope with the current situation, we would suggest trying to minimize the time that is actually the students are actually gonna be spending in the lab. And you can do this by assigning activities that students can do at home. So this could be a full lab session if it's possible, or perhaps even just some parts of it. Also try to have any pre-lab and post-lab work. And so helping the students to be preparing the theoretical concepts that will be explored during the lab time, and then with the techniques and equipment that they will be using. You may also consider that some of the content that you create can be reused in the future. So for example, if you happen to develop some safety videos and guides to minimize the time that is spent in the lab, this is something you can keep using once the things go back, let's say, to the new normal, and then consider using some online simulations and virtual labs that you can find online. You can find either free or paid simulations that could reduce a lot of the time or the work that is going to be done in the lab. Adhere also to the policies on social distances that are established by the government and also the universities. And in order to get more ideas on how you can find tools or what approach you might take, you might want to communicate with peers and colleagues that are working in the same area about how they are planning or they have been delivering their own labs. So that could also be in the form of study cases from people in other universities or in the same area. There are also delivering online labs. And even though their approach may not fit exactly to what you are looking, it might give you some good ideas. And finally, as with any course, and you have to also consider that it can be also hard for students. So keep in mind just general online considerations such as the struggle that the students might have with the technology. Also keep always safety first, use common sense and in looking up for what the students can achieve on their own and online. And just remember that they can also have their own broadband issues. And if you require them to have any sort of equipments or materials or so on, then be very precise and clear with all the instructions that you have.
Cedar, that is super. Thank you so much. I'm so aware we could have a webinar on each of these questions, and I'm sorry that I have to wrap up very soon, but I want to ask a question of Martin, Julie, and Kevin before I do so. So if your responses could maybe just be very succinct. So I'm just aware that people have to leave and people are already leaving the webinar. Martin, to yourself, there's been a lot of questions around the balance between the synchronous and the asynchronous activity. Have you any advice on how to strike a balance in that space?
I mean, some people try to give formulas, you know, like this amount, and I don't think there is a formula, so I'm going to avoid that altogether. And I think it will depend, you know, it may depend upon discipline and the level of the students and what you're trying to get them to do. So I think really just try to think how you're making best use of those things. You know, if you want to, the face-to-face, you know, we all know face-to-face is really good for getting people to chat around stuff. And, you know, I mentioned the kind of social stuff earlier on. Don't underestimate, even if it's you're bringing them together and actually what they're talking about is Harry Potter. I don't know. It's like, as long as they're making those bonds, actually there is a kind of real pedagogic benefit to that. So don't get them together and then just talk at them for an hour and don't allow them to kind of interact with each other, because that's the bit where they can really do that and do that usefully. But also kind of allowing them to ask questions and follow up on stuff. And I did a blog post a couple of days ago where I was reminiscing about OU summer schools. And you may remember we used to run summer schools for like a week in the summer, and they were really useful for students. And I think one way to think about the kind of blend you're doing now is almost like a distance education school with a really extended summer school that's kind of going through it. So what are the bits you want to do either face-to-face or synchronously, you know, that you'd want to do in that summer school, which are the other bits that you can do at a distance and asynchronously.
Okay, thanks very much, Martin. And Julie, to you, questions around bringing a department up to speed, you know, especially with all the different digital confidence within the department. Have you any advice for us on that?
Well, yeah, Trish, I think a lot of Clena's advice transfers here too, which is recognizing the various levels that people are at, but particularly that pedagogy first, I think. I think, we know how to teach people. So I think thinking about how to teach and then finding the tool that's going to help us do that, I think is the correct approach as a department rather than the other way around.
Okay.
I think it can also be very useful in a department. I think you can see even here, so many people here, a lot of people struggling individually, Trish. I think really at a department level, it's important to make use of the natural groupings. There's natural groupings, whether it's program level or subject level, that can help, I think, to bring a group of people together and maybe to tackle some of these specific discipline problems, just as some of the ones that Caesar there has been talking about. So don't underestimate the power of those natural groupings, I think, to get little pools of competence throughout.
Julie, that's super. Thanks a million. And Kevin is very apt to give the student voice the final say here. Kevin, what do you think will be held, even if we were back to face-to-face learning? What do you think the experience of students that they would like to retain?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think based on the feedback that we've received from the survey, I think the key thing that came through was that flexibility piece, and it was the recognition of the different types of students within the community and within the classroom. And I'd like to see that continuing forward, and I think a lot of students would. I mean, they already talked earlier, the team talked about universal design for learning. And I think there's so much that can be learned from taking those approaches in the design of education. I think on top of that, then I think that sense that everybody felt that they were sort of in it together. And I did get that from some of the responses that came through, that students felt a lot of admiration for the role and responsibility that staff were taking on and trying to move things online. And although it may have felt that they were even more distanced, at times probably felt that they were more together because there's more opportunities to engage in different ways. So trying to think creatively and outside of the box and how you can make the best of what's available to you and how you can create that community online is really important, and it's something I think students would like to see continue.
That's super, Kevin. Every cloud has a silver lining, I suppose. Unfortunately, we don't have time to ask any more questions, and it just leaves it for me to thank all our presenters, Dr. Sharon Flynn, Maureen Monroe, David Maloney, Kevin McStravock, and Martin Wheeler. I'd like to acknowledge Sharon's work here as the project manager, and she's provided exceptional leadership in this project. So I think we could just give her a little clap if you can there. And also just to thank Leah O'Sullivan. We don't see her, but she's behind and keeping us all on track. She's the head of communications at the IUA. And thank you, Leah, for hosting it. Now we see her. And also to you, the delegates, for your participation and engagement. But a very special thanks to our guest speaker, Professor Weller. Thank you very, very much. So wishing you all well and good health. Have a lovely afternoon.